today for Women's History Month, we have the Forgotten Stories of Oakland County Women by Miss Carol. We're a historian from Oakland County Parks and Recreation to join us. Well, you.
We'll go, okay. I always like coming here to talk. I see familiar faces. That's always nice for me. I am the historian for Oakland County Parks. As far as we know, I'm the only historian who works solely with a county park system. Some historians assign national parks, a few with state parks. So it's kind of cool that the county has recognized through our park system that history is important. So what do I do? Well, we have 14 original parks. Our newest parks are Pontiac Oaks, the old Hawthorne Park in Pontiac. That's a park of ours now. And Southfield Oaks. That's down by Beach Woods Park. Actually, Beach Woods is going to be around it. We have a little chunk. We're going to be interpreting beautiful natural area there. And then we have a park down in Hazel Park, Royal Oak Township, and Oak Park that we are working with communities to develop. So 19 parks. My job, the history of the land and people on those parks from indigenous times till today. So we're talking 10,000 years of history. So it keeps me busy. You know, people say, oh, you're a historian, you just have one county. Oh, we've got history here, let me tell you. But here's what I found. It's Women's History Month. As I've been doing history in Oakland County for some 10 years now, I have found that in many cases, women have been marginalized. In other words, they're not as big a part of the story as they really were. In some cases, they're simply not there. I'll give you an example. Here's the 1877 Oakland County history book. Inside, 125 biographies of people. A couple of them 2 pages, all of them at least 1 page. And out of 125, 0 are women. Now, you have to have been able to find a woman at that time. I can name 20 right offhand. And they got left out. Oh, it gets worse. This is 1891, the Portrait and Biographical Album of Oakland County, which it says, prominent and representative citizens. Representative means they represent who the people are in your county. Well, we had a whole lot of women at that time. There are 640 biographies. 5 are women. That's not a very, and except for one case, every woman is listed as Mrs. Simon Stowell, not even with their first name. So I've been working a lot on trying to identify women in Oakland County, and not always the big famous people, but the everyday people. And you're going to see particularly a couple that I chose today. One I'm going to start with right near you, Independence. Well, let me tell you the 3 first. I'm going to do an architect, and then I'm going to talk about a governess. I've been fascinated because I was a teacher. What did governesses do? You'll see an interesting woman and a Civil War widow. So 3, you think, wow, 3 really different people, and they were. But they all had these fascinating lives that really got left out of the narrative in many cases. So let me start here, Independence Oaks. You live by my most favorite park. Now, don't tell anybody I told you this, but that's #1 for me park-wise. I love Independence. Fascinating history and just a beautiful park. But I want to tell you the story of Esther Hoyt, a Civil War widow who's very much connected to that park. Here's 1857 map. That red outline is Independence Oaks. And right across the street was a tiny little farm of the Hoyt family. And Mr. Hoyt, Joseph Hoyt, was a blacksmith. So he didn't farm much. He didn't need a small piece of land. He was the main blacksmith in that area of Independence. And his daughter was named Esther Ann Hoyt. And you'll see she grew up on that little piece of land. And in 1856, she married. She married a person named Eldad Smith. And he was a local guy. He grew up right here. Here's the Brandon line. You know, we're independent, we're right on the edge there. So he grew up on that farm. Now look how close they were. Keep in mind, in those days, you tended to marry the guy next door. No eHarmony, no Match.com. So it was people who were nearby. So they had grown up together. So they would marry, and I found them in the 1860 census. They were in Brandon on a chunk of his family farm. And you'll see they've married, and they've already had a little boy named Jesse, age 3. And then the Civil War, 1861, will occur. And you know it turns everything upside down, completely. As the Civil War broke out and as it went on and on, lots of things happening. For example, Samuel Hoyt was one of Esther's brothers. He enlisted in the 14th Infantry early on, 1862. So he enlists, and less than a year later, he's killed during the war. He's buried in Nashville. He's not buried in our area. And then Charles Hoyt, who was only 17, officially shouldn't even have been allowed to enlist, but by 1864, they weren't checking, no driver's license. But so he enlists in the 4th Michigan Infantry. Less than a year later, according to the records you see here, he dies of disease. What kinds in the Civil War? Typhoid fever was killing, cholera, all kinds of things. More people were killed of disease in the Civil War than anything else. So he passes away. So now poor Esther has lost 2 brothers during the war. 1 month after Charles enlisted, her husband did, Eldad Smith. He will enlist in the same infantry, the 4th Infantry. You see it all the time. Cousins enlisting in the same regiment, brother and brother-in-law. You know, that was super common. So he will enlist in September of 1804. But just after he enlisted, before he left, he bought a piece of land, bought 40 small acres, and that was located, I'll show you here, that was his land, the deed was right there, right almost across from her parents' area where they're living. What was he trying to do? He wanted to know while he was gone, there'd be somebody to watch over her. And he felt it was important, although they'd been living near his parents, that she be close to her parents. So he buys a little farm. Now imagine, now she has a little farm, and by that time she had 2 other children, actually 3 other children. And she's now got the farm to take care of, 3 children to take care of. We forget the fact that women had to keep these farms going. Well, then you go out and you hire a farm laborer, except there weren't many there. Where were they all? Fighting in the Civil War. So it's a challenge. She was lucky because her parents were across the street, and she still had 1 younger brother that would have helped. Now, according to the records I found, he was hospitalized, Eldad Smith, in Nashville, the same place her brother one of her brothers had died, from measles and blood poisoning. Think about that, measles, deadly then. And he had contracted blood poisoning. Lots of different ways to get blood poisoning, but he was hospitalized. Fortunately, he survived, and he went back, fought again, and he would leave in 1866 and come home to that little farm that he had just purchased. However, he passed away in January of 1867. He'd hardly been home, not even a year. Cause of death? Blood poisoning. You know, when we look at the casualties in the Civil War, we forget many, and it's hard to document. Many of them came home and will die within a year because they've been injured, they contracted something. And he's a perfect example of this. Making, of course, he's buried in Seymour Lake Cemetery. You know, it's a great cemetery nearby here, lots of history there. Now, Esther's a widow. She has 3 sons, ages 8, 3, and 1. Think about that. And not only that, I discovered she was 5 months pregnant. So imagine that. Now you've lost your husband, 3 children to take care of, and you're pregnant with another child. What is she going to do? She's going to marry again. She's going to marry, and she doesn't do it right away, but she does marry again. She marries someone called William Griggs in 1869, about 2 years later. Now, here was the problem. I was curious about who William Griggs was. I assumed someone she knows, someone from Independence, from Clarkston, somebody the family knew. I could not find him, couldn't find anything about him. And I wondered how he got missed in the records. You'll see why in a minute, but she does marry him. 1870, they're living on her farmland, okay? This had been her farm that Eldad bought. He's here, and then there's the 3 boys, and here's the little girl that was born, that she was pregnant with. Finally, she had a girl named Alta. Now, notice, William Griggs does not adopt the children. They're still Smith. And I thought, well, that's kind of unusual. You would think that he would adopt those children and they would use his name. Often, even though they don't go through legal adoption, the children use the name. So I had thought, that's a little odd. And then it got sadder. 4 years later, in the Pontiac Weekly, that little girl, a lovely little child of 7, she will pass away. I don't know what. In the 1870s, out here in Independence, there was a lot of diphtheria. There were several children buried. I'm going to guess diphtheria at that time, but she passes away. So now poor Esther has lost her husband. Now she's lost that little baby girl. By 1880, here was Esther living with her oldest son, Jesse Smith, on her farm in Independence, which is now right part of our park, of course, which is why she's so important to our park history. But who's missing? Her husband. I said, oh my gosh, she's a widow again. Something has happened to William Griggs. So I assumed, what would she do? She married again. She waited for a while. Now, she married William Cothrow, who was a blacksmith. Notice, he was 75. She was 59. 75 in 1892 was old, was the equivalent of 85 maybe. And I was curious, how did they meet? And it turns out that, remember, he was a blacksmith. Her father must have known him. And you don't know any of the dynamics. Remember, here's what the marriage record, but it doesn't tell us. Were they in love? How did that happen? She was so much older. That's what we don't know. I'm just hoping that 3rd marriage was a happy one. You know, you just have to hope for that. But here she is. And then it took a twist and a turn. Her whole life did. And that's because I located a pension record in the National Archives. I was doing research on Civil War soldiers from Oakland County in the National Archives. And I found a pension record for Eldad Smith. Pension record is the best history on a person you'll ever find because it documents when they enlisted, where they had been, when they had marriage. And it turned out that she had, after William Griggs disappeared, apparently, I said, or passed away, she applied for a widow's pension, which she qualified for them. And it took a little time. She actually never was approved, I found out, but all the paperwork's there. And in that paperwork, it said, Mr. Griggs married me under an assumed name, and I was not aware of it for 5 years. No wonder I couldn't have found him. He was using an assumed name. And she says, during all the time I lived with him, he was ugly to me and treated me very cruelly, threatening to strike me, once jamming the door against my hand so that it broke my finger. Being married to him, I supposed I must live with him and stand his abuse. Oh my gosh, same thing happens even today. You know, she felt, I'm married to him, I don't have any options, I have children, I have to stay. But then, when I found that he had deceived me and married me under an assumed name, I left him. And that's when she leaves him. Exactly, had the courage to leave him. Now, she apparently, by 18 maintained the land, but she apparently said, you're going to have to go, you know, which wasn't recorded here, but that had to have happened. So think about that. Now I would have never known that. I assumed he had passed away and just no death record for him. Now, the court did dissolve her marriage in 1884. She went to court and said, I want the marriage dissolved. I don't want on the record, all right? And so the court did. Now, 1900 census, she was still alive. I found her in Grand Rapids, and William Cothro was still alive, her husband. He was 83 and she was 67. So into 1900. And here's where you just hope, where were they living? With his daughter and son-in-law in Grand Rapids. They had moved. And here's where you just hope it was a happy marriage. You know, they're still together by 1900. They've been married 8 years. So you just kind of hope for her. And that's about a census record. Doesn't give you much information about it, just that they're in Grand Rapids. I found out that here's her death certificate. She will die in 1903. And the cause of death, creeping paralysis from age and physical exhaustion. You know, when you think of her life, a lot of us can relate. A lot of us can relate. And you think back to the multiple tragedies she faced in her life. I mean, it's amazing, starting with the death of her husband, then her child, an abusive marriage, then she will marry again, move to Grand Rapids and she's been in Independence her whole life. And then she will move, different place, different area. And then you just wonder, no wonder she was physically exhausted. Surprisingly, here's what I found unusual. On the death certificate from this time period, it will say how many children a woman had. It says 6. 6, I said, wait a minute. I count 3 boys and little Alta, who passed away, which means what happened to her? She'd lost 2 other children, likely very young. So I thought, and compound the tragedy, she had lost 3 children over time, really. William outlived her. I mean, he must have been quite a hardy guy. He will die in the end of 1903. I found that he was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Grand Rapids, but she wasn't there. I said, wait a minute, where was she buried? Then I remembered, at this time period, a death certificate will tell you where the burial place was. So I went back to the death certificate, and I noticed it said Clarkston. Then I remembered Seymour Lake Cemetery is listed as being in Clarkston. A little rural cemetery usually has the closest town, and that would be Clarkston. So it ends up she must be buried here. Now if we look, here is Eldad, here is his parents. There's no other gravestones there. So I am convinced she has to be there. So I went and I looked. This is the listing for Seymour Lake Cemetery. This gives you, at this time now there are 6. There were 8 burial plots to a lot. And you'll notice the Smith lot has all 8 filled. Now think about that, I said, wait a minute. I can only account for 3 people. So that tells me, I'm guessing, another one of the people buried there is little Alta. I'm convinced that she's there and was buried likely with her grandparents at that time and her father. So that gives me that. And then I just know in my heart that that Esther is there. I'm convinced, no gravestone, but think about that. When she passed away, William Cothro, who was actually more from Holly, he wasn't from Independence, he must have made arrangements to have her buried with her son and I think her child. You think about that. She had gone to Grand Rapids, but her life was here. And somehow I'm convinced that she's buried there. And then the other 2 possible burials, the 2 children she lost, which would probably have happened early in Independence. So I think probably. Now, will we ever find out? Well, I've checked to see, I've been bugging, the Seymour Lake is run by Brandon Township where I live. I know there's more records somewhere, so I'm going to hound them once again. There has to be a little card that says those burials took place. Right now, I just have the map. But again, it just is a reminder of the widows of the Civil War, that often are people we never hear about. And I was convinced to find her and track her through time. I could have just left her when she was still here, but I had to find out more about her. You know, that's what history is. She's still connected to us here, very much connected. And she's a perfect example of a Civil War widow and what happens to them when they're left with a farm and children. They remarry, then what happens? And now I'm going to take you to Addison Oaks. Buell Mansion? Everybody been up there? Well, let me tell you, story 2 is my search for the Buell family governess. You know, my son calls me the history detective. And it really is, when you think about it. It took me, I probably researched Esther for at least a year, and then kept going back because I had gaps there and trying to find out what had happened to her. Now, in this case, I'm going to show how it's like a puzzle, finding piece by piece. Here are Lawrence and Cora Buell, wealthy Detroiters, who will build out in Addison Township this amazing Tudor house and estate that now is Addison Oaks County Park. Now, when they built the house in 1927, they had 3 young daughters. And I noticed when I got the blueprints for the house, the architect had designed 3 very cool different bedrooms. If you've never been out there, I'll come in the fall. I do some tours out there. In the fall, I'll do a big event out there. Hay rides, all kinds. It's a very cool thing. We call it Fall into History. But you'll get to see the mansion if you haven't seen it. So there were 3 children's bedrooms. And then I noticed up here a governess's bedroom. So they must have had a governess, I said, when they built the house. Well, I was obsessed with trying to find her. You know, when you study a mansion, all the history is about the rich people. You know, it's always about Lawrence, and not that much about his wife, by the way. I've been interested in the cook and the butler. I've been researching them. But number 1 on my list was the governess. I was curious who was in charge and teaching their children and traveling with the family. So there was the governess's room. I'd been in that room before. Now I had to find her. I started with the 1830 census in Detroit. I knew that likely they wouldn't be on the census in Addison because for them it was weekends and summer vacation time. And sure enough, there they were. Here were Lawrence and Cora Buell. And down a little ways was a person living in their household because the numbers match. 259, 355, those met, which meant they were in the same household. And sure enough, it said that this woman, who was named Martha C. Abruti, a French name, was the governess. I had found her. Well, I'd found her name. So I had some puzzle pieces. Now I had a name. Then I went back to the census. 1930 census has a load of information. Told her age. She was 38 at the time. She had been born in France. Aha, the French name. She had immigrated in 1919. Now I knew that she'd come here in 1919. And that last one was a big key. This is the category for naturalization. Like for my grandfather, there was an NA there. So I knew by 1930 he'd become a U.S. citizen. He was naturalized. She hadn't yet. When you see a PA, it means first papers. She had begun the process, which is a long process, to become a citizen. I said, if she's done that, there's a paper trail. And sure enough, there was. So I had more pieces, and I began to search for immigration records. Here was her certificate of arrival. So it told, again, she arrived in December of 1919. It even told the name of the ship she was on. I needed more, though. I couldn't find more, so that's when I went to Ellis Island. 1919, I said, she must have come through Ellis Island. So many people would have, the large majority. So I put her name into the Ellis Island search, and it came up with nothing. I said. Then I remembered, if you're ever searching Ellis Island, there's a magic button here called alternate spellings. Many of our family names got changed at Ellis Island. And I said, let me try. And I tried again with, now it's going to search for anything close to that name. And sure enough, there she was. they had replaced her U with an N. That was enough for her not to pop up until I hit the magic button. Now I was able to even find a photo of the ship she was on. You know, to me, I'm a social historian, all about people. It's amazing to actually say, this is the ship she was on. This is part of her story. And then it gave me more information. She was a teacher in France and came here and became a governess. That would make sense. A description: 5'6" tall, black hair and green eyes. Can't you begin to see her now? Oh, I could. More puzzle pieces. Now I could see more of her. The next record I found was from 1934, and it was another ship's manifest. What's she doing on a ship again, I said. Well, it said she was traveling as a governess with a family, and she was living in New York City. She must have left the Buells, probably the children were older then, and she had gone back to New York City and was a governess for another family. I had an address. I had to find it. Here it is in New York City. It was a very fancy apartment building. At the time in 1930, that's the closest census, there were about 18 families living in there. Eventually, maybe I'll find which one she was working for, but that's going to take time. But now I knew she was in New York City. More pieces of her puzzle. 1935 was the next record I found. This was her petition for naturalization, the next step in citizenship. She had moved, however. She had moved to a new address in Flushing, New York. So she must have left that family. And she was living with a Corsala family. And Vincent Corsala had been her witness. She needed a witness. I said, who was the Corsala family? Why is she there? Well, I had to find the house first. Here it is. Now it's been remodeled, of course. But now I had traced her to this house in Flushing. Here's the Corsala family. Vincent Corsala was a bass fiddle player, and he played with orchestras that played on cruise ships. How do you think she met him? On that cruise ship, I'm thinking. He was probably playing there, and they made a connection. He was married, he had children, but they must have made a connection. Can I prove that? Absolutely not. I don't know whether he was on that cruise ship, but sometimes history is about, I got missing pieces, but I'm gonna guess what the puzzle is. So that's my guess. And then I noticed the next file I found from New York was 1936. This is her final paperwork to become a U.S. citizen. She needed a sponsor, and it wasn't Vincent Corsala. It was Lawrence Buell. He had stayed in touch with his governess for multiple years now and still sponsored her. And here's where he said, she came into my employ as a governess in 1927 and stayed until 1931 for 4 years. So when that house was built, that beautiful estate, that governess room was built for her. So now she was governess then. The next paper is her oath of allegiance from 1936, which is when she becomes a United States citizen. I had to continue to find her. She didn't stay in New York. It took some time. I added puzzle pieces in. And then I found her in San Francisco in 1944. What was she doing in San Francisco? She was working as a bookkeeper. Where had she been? Why had she moved? I don't have a clue. You know, we just have these things. We begin to think she had made this big move to New York. And then I found her picture. Here she is. And the picture from around, I think, this would be the late, I'm guessing, about 1948, she has married Raleigh Dampier. Now, Dampier is a French name, all right? He had been here for a while, but somehow they met in San Francisco. He was from California, and she had finally married. They were living in Gilroy, California. I don't know what house. Now I'm thinking, wait, I've always known the houses. I'm not sure, but I know she was living in Gilroy, California. So we have more pieces. And then Raleigh will die in 1949. Now they've probably, my guess is, I found her in 44 by that photo, and then he'll die by 49. So somewhere, I'm guessing around 44, 45 is when she marries. Now, he's buried in Santa Clara Mission Cemetery, very cool old cemetery. She's not there, however. But I did find a death record that she died in 1951, 2 years later. But I can't find her in that cemetery. I think she must be there. I noticed that he's buried with his first wife. So I don't know whether she's buried there eventually. It's a long trip to California, but eventually maybe I can find someone to check. Because, you know, I'm using Find a Grave. Some of you may use that to look, and people are missed there. Find a Grave is based on people who will go and add photos and information. I did find, however, she had a last will and testament. She had a small amount of money, not a lot, that probably a small insurance from Raleigh, and just a small amount of money. And then I found, she said, I do declare that I am the widow of Raleigh Dampier, and that there were no children, the issue of the marriage. Of course, she was older by the time she married. She had no children of her own, nor have I ever had children. I have no near relatives. So apparently no one had come from France. She had spent a lot of time working for other families without really family of her own. And then she said, but I am closest to my stepchildren. He had children, and she had created relationships with all of them. And that's who she left the money to. There were 4 of them, and she left a small amount for each of them. So she finally, I said, kind of had her own family. And that's kind of nice at the end of her life. So lots of little pieces there. Still missing pieces, though. Lots of the story. But enough that I can say, when I look at the governess room and I give my tours there, that that's really Marta's room. Now I have an identity there. I know what she looked like. I know a bit about her life. And you know, that's the important part of a house like that, is being able, I can talk about the children in the children's bedroom, and now I can talk about her. And finally, I'm going to take you to Glen Oaks. Anybody been to Glen Oaks? It's far from here. It's in Farmington. And I want to talk about the postmaster of Nebish Island. Anybody know where Nebish Island is? I didn't. I had to look it up. Here's on an aerial, but a map is a better thing to look at. Here's Sault Ste. Marie, and then that's Nebish Island in the St. Mary's River there. You can only get there by ferry. It's very rural. It looks like it's an amazing place. Look, the photos I found were beautiful. And the reason I needed Nebish Island is that in the late 1930s, Miss Emily Butterfield was the postmaster of Nebish Island. And I found out that Emily Butterfield had a huge connection to our Glen Oaks, which is predominantly a golf course, and this amazing clubhouse. You'll see how she's connected. But first, I got to take you back to 1908 and the Isaac Bond Farm. Location-wise, here's 13 Mile, and this is Orchard Lake. It's right in the area where our park is. And Isaac Bond, a Bond family had been there farming, a pretty large farm. But he decided in 1925, he formed the Great Lakes Land Corporation. And his plan with his partners was to turn his farm into a subdivision. It was happening all over Oakland County, particularly along Woodward and out in this area. The DUR, the Detroit Urban Railway, was now running right down Orchard Lake. So somebody could reasonably work in Detroit and live out in Farmington now, or take Woodward Avenue. So we had in the 20s, a lot of subdivisions are growing up. So his plan to plat the area with roads on a map, have a surveyor do it, and start building housing. And then buy land on the other side of Orchard Lake and expand. And at the same time, build a cool golf course there. So you could have, and it was unique for that time, having a golf course connected with a subdivision. Here was the ad. They called it the Oaklands. And they described it as being new and distinctly different. Now, subdivisions normally have what I call cookie-cutter houses. you'll see this was a little bit different. But notice at the end it said restricted, that this was going to be restricted housing. 1920s. What might that have meant, you think? Yeah, we're at the time where we were going to exclude Black Americans, Jewish Americans in this case, and it was a time of restriction out in there, and it was totally legal at that time. So it was restricted. And then it had a golf course. Now the golf course was described as being by invitation only and were limited both as to numbers and quality. You think it was the quality of your golf game? I don't think so. And listen to this. If you are a golfer and the right kind of man, you can join. We were excluded too. It was we couldn't join that golf club. So a time of restriction. But that was a way they were encouraging people, come out here, you've got this beautiful area. Here was the Bond Farm. The house and barn were still there, but all around it were these areas where the houses were built. Initially, this many. They were called small estates. They were the equivalent of 6 city lots. That was why it was distinctive. And they planned that every house would be different. So they said to the architects who were applying for this, we want every house to be different. And they hired the architectural firm of Butterfield and Butterfield, which was made up of Wells Butterfield and his daughter, Emily Butterfield. Very unique for the 1920s. Father-daughter team of architects. They had been designing together a lot of churches. This is Farmington Methodist Church, just a gorgeous church. Vaulted ceiling, a lot of stained glass. They had traveled in Europe studying architecture and came back and applied that here. Here's an apartment building they designed in Detroit. Notice that one in New York where Martha was living, it kind of looks like that. I said, oh, this is kind of odd. I'm researching these two women. Highland Park High School, which is amazing in the inside. Look at the vaulted roofs again, the design of the high school. I had to find more about Emily Butterfield. I learned that in 1904, she went to Syracuse to study architecture. Why didn't she do it here? She couldn't. Syracuse is one of the few universities in 1904 that was accepting women into the program. Think about that. We weren't able to design buildings, silly women. So she goes to Syracuse. She comes back, and in 1907, she's the first woman to be a licensed architect in Michigan. How cool, I said. Oakland County woman, she's #1 to be an architect. She is the one who will design the houses. So she'll start every house unique. This one she called the Ocean Wave House because of the ocean waves on the roof. Here, one of her favorites, the Cotswold Cottage. And then in the inside, that incredible. If you ever go to Glen Oaks for an event, the fireplace there looks exactly like this. You'll see why in a minute. This 2-story one with sunrooms on both sides. This is cool. If you look at it, you might see a barn, and that's because it was a barn. She decided to try and save one of the pieces of the Bond Farm. So she had that barn moved over across the fields and then designed this amazing, I wish I had interior pictures of this, it's supposed to be beautiful, this barn into a house. But her masterpiece was the clubhouse of the golf course. This one has all the design elements of what her and her father were doing. Ornate stonework everywhere, turrets, these little towers, and then a vaulting slate roof. In the inside, it's amazing, especially the upper story. She designed like this banquet room, a dance hall. It's amazing. And then what happened? The Depression came. All over Oakland County, these subdivisions that begin to just stop. And you could see that everything just halts within the subdivision. Now there are just these few houses kind of stranded by themselves. It won't be till 1940s and 50s that it will develop with housing, which are more cookie cutter. But if you go through the subdivision, these houses of Emily's are all of a sudden among all these houses that look very much the same. Now the golf club will survive the Depression and will keep going over time. And then in 1978, we will purchase it. We'd been looking for some parkland in the South, and we were interested. We were big on golf courses at that time, and we will develop that. It'll become Glen Oaks County Park, and then it is our only park that has a Michigan designated historic site on it. It's got the magic green sign, I always call it. And then in 1990s, it was too small for us. We were doing a lot of banquets there and a lot of golf events. So we added on into the back. What tends to happen when you have a very historic, cool structure and you do an addition? It doesn't look anything like the other part. You've probably been in places where there's a historic piece and then there's an add-on that just doesn't seem to fit. This is before I worked for parks, but somebody made a great decision, and it cost extra bucks, but look how we designed the banquet room. Look at her churches. We designed it so that it was an Emily designed structure. We took what was important to her and used those design elements. I think she'd be so happy of that room. I always think when I'm there, I know, Emily, you're watching. I know you love this place. Well, I was curious about more about her. You know, I knew she was an amazing architect, but I was curious, what else? I found out she was a founding member of the Detroit Business Women's Club. That was the first professional women's club in the country. So she'd been involved in that. She wrote a book for children about architecture. And having started out as a teacher, I'm always a sucker for children's books. It's amazing. I found out later on in her life she taught painting. She's a painter herself, you'll see. So she gave free painting classes to children in Algonac, where she had grown up. I found some of her paintings. Many of them, if you remember the old Hudson's building, at least 4 years in a row, they did an exhibit of her work at Hudson's. And there's other places in Detroit you'll see her watercolor work. And then she helped establish a camp for underprivileged children in Jackson, Michigan. A group purchased the land. She designed the camp, and she supervised the construction herself. And from 1920 to 1924, she was a camp manager in the summer. So think of the variety she was doing in her life. I found her in Who's Who of America for 1914 and 1915, when it said, she favors women's suffrage. I found out she was involved in the fight for the women's vote, which always is important to me. But what did she like to do? Swimming, sketching, tramping, and pantsy culture. Now, tramping kind of caught me up there. Tramping, I said, what did they mean by that? Then it occurred to me, think of that, historian, language changes over time. In those days, tramping meant to just take a long walk. It was like used more than hiking. Oh, I went tramping over the weekend. And then pansy culture. I learned that in early 1900s to around 1920, people were experimenting with pansies, all the different colors you could get, and she was fascinated by that. And then, of course, she will retire to Nebish Island, where it said she had a small cottage. It doesn't seem like she designed it and built it. I think it was already there. But I imagine it not like that, but like that was pansies all around it. I think that's what it looked like. Now, remember, in 1937, she'll become postmaster on that little island. She will pass away in 1958. She's buried in the cemetery in Algonac. And right next to the person she said was my best friend, my teacher, my mentor, my father, Wells Butterfield. In 1990, she was inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame. So we see differences here. We see someone like Esther Hoyt Smith, who kind of disappears in history. And then we see a governess who really, Until I researched her, nobody much her. And then Emily Butterfield, who's finally recognized in 1990. Now, many years after she's passed away, but she's in the Women's Hall of Fame. And I found that somebody interviewed her, asking her about her life, and this is what she said. I guess the best way to describe me is I am a person who makes my own path or avenue to travel down. Could you see that in her life? Yeah, she made her own way at a time when women weren't accepted into the architecture program. She built a camp for underprivileged children. She becomes an artist. I did not follow the conventional avenues of my time. I did things my way. At an early age, I decided to build my life entirely after my own ideals of happiness and service. To some, this may sound selfish, yet I am truly content with my life. Don't you want to be able to say that you're content with your life? You know, I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. And women, during Women's History Month, who've made their own way. Esther did that too. She somehow, in her resilient way, made her own pathway. And so did Martha, who came by herself from France in 1919 and then worked for other people's family, as in, is it here, and in New York, and then in San Francisco. So she made her own pathway too. I think that's the kind of women we want to think about, is making our own pathway. So we had Emily, and we had Martha the governess, and then Esther, the Civil War widow. 3 really remarkable women. And I'm hoping that we can learn more during Women's History Month. I always take it upon myself to learn 2 new women during Women's History Month that I can add to. I am working on the cook at the Beale Mansion. I'm curious who cooked for them, because I think she was there a long time. I will invite you, because you're close by. During the summertime, I do pontoon rides on Crooked Lake at Independence Oaks, and I teach the history of the area, the park and beyond it, from the pontoon boat. We can take 10 people at a time, and we start in June. We do two cruises each for an evening. It's a wonderful way to learn history, just relaxing. So sign up with friends and come out and join me on Crooked Lake. Now we have time for questions. If anybody has questions or comments? Yes.
Esther, I'm the widow, and she lived on property that's now Independence Oaks.
Yes.
Now, did she donate that to them, or?
No, she ends up, I did find out that after she finds out about William Griggs, she stays there for a while. And the problem becomes 1890 census, remember, burned in Washington. We have a gap. So I know she marries in 1892, but there's a gap there. I'm assuming when she marries and William Griggs, that's when she sells the land. Now, I can go back and follow that. That's a good thing for me to do. I can find in the records for our park when she will sell it, but I'm assuming it's then. It may have been that Jessie will stay on there. Later on, the William Darling family will move into that house. They'll be there for a while. But right, when we buy the land, it's owned by a man named Irvin. And it's been, if you know the history of our park, we're a hunt club after the farms are there. It's got a fascinating history. And first of all, the big company buys it and raising Hereford cattle. Then it's a hunt club. It's amazing history out there. But yeah, but that's what's important, is that when we have a park, this is our biggest park, 1,200 acres. That's a piece of land 1 mile by 2 miles. And there's a lot of history on a piece of land like that. I'm working on indigenous history. We have an artifact, a projectile point, a knife point, a Brewerton point specifically, found right across the road from our park. That's 8,000 years old. So we have old history. On the northern part of our park, there was a Native American trail that crossed right there. So we know we begin with indigenous history. And then in the 1930s, a series of farmers will purchase the land. and their histories are there. So to me, parkland is anybody who's ever lived on that parkland. That's the story my job is to tell. The story of people like Esther and the Bailey family. Some of you know the Bailey family. I've been researching forever and ever. Are you part of the Bailey family? Oh, yeah, that's very cool. We'll have to chat. You know, the Bailey family has a long history there. Just incredible history. And all of it is part of who we are as a park. Before I came on, honestly, parks were trails and trees. And then I said, you know what, I think we have some history here. And I started with Addison. The way I got onto is that the executive of our county at that time said, I want to come to Addison for a meeting. I want to go to the Buell Mansion and I want to tour. And Park said, okay. Then they realized they didn't know anything about that house that they bought. So someone in Parks had met me and said, we need a historian real fast. Can you do the history of the mansion? Enough to get a tour. So I did. And then I said, but wait a minute, there were people here before the Buells. So then I started backward. And then before the Snyders, there was an indigenous village right near here. So then I had this whole bunch of history. Then what did other park supervisors say? We want you to do that for us. So then they hired me on half-time, and now that's what I do, half-time history. Anything else? Well, good. If you think of something, you can easily get through your folks here, my email. I'm really accessible. And then come do the pontoon boat with me. That would be fun. Or in fall, come out to the Buell Mansion, take the tour, and take it's an accessible hay wagon, so anybody can get on our wagon, and we'll take you around the whole estate. Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. Thank you.